So one of the hallmarks of sibling life, as I'm sure many of you know, is incessant fighting. And my 3- and 6-year-old are no exception. One of my big challenges in parenting is not jumping in to act as their referee. However, I can't stop myself from offering what I think are some very helpful tips on working through conflict. Things like screeching might not be the best mode of communication if you want someone to listen. Or it seems like yelling over each other isn't solving your problem. I wonder if there's something else you might try. Sometimes it even helps a little. Other times we just reach an impasse. Say one of them wants to pretend to look at rainbows with the binoculars and the other one wants to draw rainbows. There's not an obvious problem here, except for the part where each of them want the other one to do the exact same thing as they want to do. Now, this exact scenario happened just the other night, with both sides digging in their heels as that this was the only way to play. In a last-ditch effort, I tried pulling out a Daniel Tiger song and advised them to find a way to play together. They both simply looked at me with derision and went back to grumpily declaring their positions. We were saved that night only by the fact that it quickly became time to move on to the next part of the evening. Now, as is so often the case, I find that dealing with young children reminds me a lot of dealing with adults. We are not so different when it comes to our disagreements. And the biggest differences being that our screaming often takes the form of things like op-eds and social media comments. And our disagreements are about much more consequential issues than whether to look at or draw a rainbow. But we fall into so many of the same pitfalls. Talking over each other, forgetting to listen, digging in our heels, assuming that ours is the only right way. The thing is that in general, we aren't taught how to disagree. We learn about sharing and about compromise. We certainly learn about persuasion, using rhetoric and making arguments to convince someone to our side of things. But we don't really learn much about how to exist within disagreement, to stay in relationship through the discomfort, to seek out understanding rather than full agreement. This is one of the key skills, though, that we need to live in a pluralistic world. Ethical culture leader Michael Franch points out that this is one of the key differences between diversity and pluralism. He says, diversity can just mean that we have lots of differences and we're seeing each other as the other. We live side by side, at best ignoring each other, at worst experiencing friction. Pluralism, he says, means we've grappled with our differences. It means the energetic engagement with diversity. It's not just about getting along. Now, engaging with pluralism requires us to confront our differences, to name them and to explore them and to try to understand one another more deeply. In the new articulation of our Unitarian Universalist core values, pluralism is one of the 6 values that is named. And what I love about the way that it's named is that it tells us how we best engage with pluralism. It reads, "We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and our commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect." Love, curiosity, and respect. These seem like a great place to start when it comes to learning about how to engage with pluralism, to explore our differences rather than avoid them. It is often not our first instinct to engage in this way, but when we're able to do it, it can be totally transformative. In that story about Wally and Freya that we heard during the Wonder Box, this is exactly how Freya approaches Wally about the drawings, with love, curiosity, and respect. She sees that he too is sad, and so instead of approaching him with anger, she gets curious. Through her curiosity, she learns that Wally is being mean because he feels like he is alone. And with that knowledge, they're able to work together to stop Wally from harming other kids and bring him back more fully into community. You just never know what you're going to learn when you approach someone with curiosity rather than judgment, with love rather than animosity. A colleague of mine recently told me a story of a church that was in conflict over the shutters in the sanctuary, specifically whether they should remain open or closed during the service. A classic church conflict, right? Now the two factions were getting more and more upset with each other, and the position of the shutters kept getting changed based on who last had the chance to change it. So the minister decided to call a meeting about the issue with one condition for attendance at the meeting. If you came, you had to come with an open heart. That's all they asked. Now, the person who shared this story with me told me that she did not have a lot of confidence that this meeting was going to work, but she decided to go and to follow the instructions and come with an open heart. As the two sides shared where their opinion about the shutters came from, the conflict around it dissipated. You see, the people who wanted the shutters open really appreciated seeing the beauty of the greenery outside during the service, and they felt like that enhanced their worship experience. Whereas those who wanted the shutters closed were frustrated when they were open because they couldn't see the preacher well enough, which detracted from their worship experience. When explained clearly, both desires seemed entirely reasonable. They were not actually in opposition in any way, other than the fact that they were both affected by the very same set of shutters. So you may be wondering, who won? What did the church do with those shutters? Well, the conclusion of the meeting was actually not about the shutters at all. They decided instead to move the pulpit so that it was not right in front of the window. That way, those who liked the greenery could still look out at it, and those who were struggling to see the preacher would be able to do that as well. It was a simple, elegant solution to a conflict that had seemed to be at an impasse, all because the congregation was able to come together in the spirit of curiosity and love to figure out what the real problem was and find a solution. There's a lot that we can learn from this little church conflict. Approaching a conflict with curiosity nearly always leads to more understanding on both sides, and more understanding leads to more openness to different ways of thinking and doing. And of course, the root of the problem may not always be what it seems. When both parties are willing to come to the table and listen, we can learn so much about our differences, and often come to find more common ground than we would have believed possible. Many of our disagreements, of course, are not so easy and elegant to resolve as the issue of the church shutters. We wish that were so. Things get more nuanced and complicated very quickly, especially when it comes to disagreements about worldview or core values. No matter how much we listen to each other, there may end up being things that we just fundamentally disagree about. And then we have to decide, is this a situation where we are better off agreeing to disagree? Or is this an opportunity to continue the conversation, either to push back or to try to understand better? This was the decision that the person in our words for reflection had to make in that moment at the dinner table. Organizational psychologist Adam Grant would say that we often move too quickly to the place of agreeing to disagree. He studies and writes mostly about conflict in the workplace, but has also looked at political polarization, which we know is an issue that is very alive at this moment. Between the upcoming election this fall and the war in Gaza, among everything else that is going on, there is plenty for us to disagree about. And Grant says that when we simply agree to disagree, we effectively shut down the conversation, leaving no room for deepening understanding of one another's points of view. Grant also points out that our sense of polarization may actually be out of proportion to reality. It is, after all, the most extreme views that are often the loudest. And the vast majority of people are probably closer to being in agreement than we think. But we won't know this, of course, if we shut down the conversation too soon. So Grant encourages us to approach these conversations about our differences like scientists. He says, we spend way too much time thinking and speaking like preachers, prosecutors, and politicians. Only I'm supposed to do that, right? When what we really need to do is realize what we don't know and treat our beliefs like hypotheses that need to be tested. We need to go into these conversations interested in discussing to learn rather than arguing to win. That can be hard when you're talking about one of these hot button issues. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't interested ultimately in convincing the other person of our view, but our initial goal, at least, is to understand where they are coming from, to gain perspective on what the issue is from their point of view. This past week, our Nashua Area Interfaith Council met for our monthly meeting, and we finally had a conversation about the war in Gaza. This is an issue that has taken us months to even approach the conversation. But as a group that holds as a core value the importance of connecting over differences, it seemed vital to at least try. And I think it went pretty well, surprisingly. We solved nothing in our conversation. That was not the goal. But we did get a chance for some deep listening and learning from one another. We began by sharing about personal connections to the conflict and then moved into learning some of the background and talking about potential resolution. It was not always an easy conversation. There were absolutely disagreements. But I am sure that every person in the room learned something or thought about the situation in a way that hadn't occurred to them before. It was a beginning, at least, and good practice for how such conversations can go well. I hope it encourages everyone who was in the room that day to continue those conversations, to know that they can work, that they can be productive. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that every time you try will be a success or will bring you to some kind of common ground. I have also had plenty of interfaith conversations about topics after which I am pretty sure that I don't want to work with the other person in any way going forward. I've left others feeling dismissed or derided. No matter how much openness or curiosity you bring to a conversation, it doesn't mean it's going to work, especially if the other person is not coming to it with the same spirit. There are absolutely times when it makes sense to disconnect, to avoid a particular topic or a particular person, especially when you are at risk of being harmed. And I want to be very clear that this is okay. If we are going to try to have more hard conversations, we need to make sure to take care of ourselves too. And I am certainly not about to claim in this moment in time, in this world, that we can solve everything by simply building bridges across our differences. Some of our disagreements are too fundamentally at odds for that, and calls for unity too often gloss over the very real harm that some beliefs cause. But I do think that many of us could practice the curiosity and humility that Adam Grant encourages a little bit more. And I think if we tried that, we might find ourselves more able to come to agreement, or at least a little bit more agreement, with those who are different than us than we might expect. Or, at the very least, a better understanding of another perspective. Curiosity leads to more understanding, leads to more openness to change. So may we all move with curiosity through this world that is too full of animosity and fear, trusting that our open heart will be met by the open hearts of others, leading us all into deeper understanding and care for one another. May it be so.